Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Emerson Green, and I'm here with John Buck. John,
Yo.
say hi. What's up? We're here to talk about universalism and some of the philosophical arguments for and against it. So we didn't really come prepared to have this conversation. I'm looking at you physically in person right now.
Yeah. It's kind of great because both of us have a sort of passing interest in universalism. And so we've thought about these, but neither of us had prepared statements or anything like that. And I almost wish I had a little bit more preparation, but no, it was a good conversation still.
We didn't systematically go through okay, here are the main arguments for universalism, and here are the main responses. It's just, this is an ongoing conversation where we've talked about universalism before, on Discord or Twitter or something like that, and we finally sat down to just have a real debate about it. But yeah, we didn't prepare for this. It's just a conversation, and we don't cover every single base. But what did we talk about? We talked about why I care about this in the first place as an atheist, because I don't think God exists, and I am still talking about universalism semi-regularly.
Yeah.
And we talked about the free will response against universalism. If you really believe in free will, then you can't guarantee that universalism is true. We talked about different models of hell that are way more plausible than the maximalist strong version of hell.
Yeah. We gave some of the arguments that are generally used for universalism, even though it doesn't cover the entirety of here's another universalist argument that you can put forward. But
yeah, we talked for a long time, but we've been recording for 3 hours now.
Yeah.
I just looked at the timestamp. Patrons of Counter Apologetics will also get to hear an episode about Catholicism and universalism and whether they're compatible. But yeah, we're just doing the intros here. This is a peek behind the curtain.
Yeah.
This part you're hearing first actually came last.
Yeah. But if you are a patron, be sure to go listen to that as well. Because it's interesting going over sort of the differences between Protestant and Catholic sort of conceptions of the afterlife.
And if you're already a patron, head over to patreon.com/counter and give me even more money than you're already giving me. Totally undeservedly. Well, not totally undeservedly. It's a pretty good podcast, isn't it?
Yeah. No,
yeah.
It's peak audio quality. It's only the third best podcast on panpsychism out there.
Yeah, I'm glad that so here are the 2 endorsements that I can put on the back of the book here. Third best podcast about panpsychism, which, by the way, is the other one, not this one. And the audio quality is good.
Oh, yeah. So
ringing endorsements from John Buck.
The Walden podcast doesn't even qualify either. Dang.
No, the Walden Pod one is the one about panpsychism. This is Counter Apologetics, right?
Oh, dang. I didn't realize. Oh, okay.
It's the philosophy of religion one. We've been talking about philosophy of religion for 3 hours.
Okay. They're both on the Walden Pod channel, so they're the same for me. On the YouTube channel. I don't listen to through iTunes or anything.
Oh, you don't listen to the podcast?
No, I just listen to it on YouTube.
Okay. Well, the YouTube channel is called Emerson Green, not Walden Pod, so I'm doubting that as well.
Fake fan.
Wow, yeah. Huge fake fan. I'm Walden Pod on Twitter, though. And you're writer John Buck.
Yeah.
Don't follow him. Follow me so I can surpass Redeemed Zoomer. I'm only 1,500 behind him last I checked. And I'm about 800,000 subscribers on YouTube behind him. So let's get those numbers up.
Yeah, let's get those
up. I'm going to overtake him any day now.
End of the year. That's our goal.
Wow, so this is the best intro ever for any podcast. So this is, universalism. We're debating universalism.
Loose debate.
Unstructured debate.
Yeah.
Free range conversation about universalism.
Enjoy.
Okay, so I think that you can have free will and also get everyone into heaven eventually. Because, well, for 2 reasons. First of all, I think that God could convince us, I think an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly loving being, A, is not going to give up on us, and B, knows what to say at the right time, when to say it, when to give us space and when to be more involved. And I think he can be, in addition to being maximally knowledgeable and maximally powerful and maximally wise and all that, I think because of that, he can be maximally convincing. So I think that we can have free will and he can convince us to freely choose to be in a relationship with him. If he is so motivated to do that. So then the question is just whether he has the motivation. And so that's a separate question. But the second reason, I think, which seems to be more of like a common line of response among universalists, well, look, we are totally within our rights to override free will if it's going to lead to some horrible, horrible thing. Like,
sure, yeah.
Everyone agrees that like free will, like freedom, in whatever sense you mean it, like a compatibilist sense or a libertarian sense, like it is some kind of pro tanto good to like be free.
Mm-hmm.
But like if you are, like I heard Matthew Adelstein use this example when he talked to Andrew Horanich, where he said, well, look, like if there's like a serial killer outside your door and like you don't know that,
yeah,
all things being equal, it's not good for me to like prevent you from leaving your house. Like I don't have the right to do that.
right.
Like you should have the freedom to leave your house if you want to. But if there's a serial killer outside your door and you don't know that,
yeah,
then I can override your free will. I can lock you up to keep you away from that. Like I can like lock you in the bathroom or something, and like that would be good. And once you actually understood why I did that, you would thank me. Like when you came to your senses, when you had more information.
Yeah.
So like first of all, this whole idea that like, well, you can't have universalism if you have free will. I think that's wrong because you can override free will if the circumstances are right, like if the consequences would be terrible enough.
Mm-hmm.
And second of all, even if we have free will, God can be maximally convincing. And in the fullness of time, like I grant that like maybe if there are like time constraints, like you have to repent before your earthly death, and at the moment of your death, you are either in one place or the other. Like that could be problematic, but given that we can talk about hypertime, where, you know, time just moves at a very different pace for you than everyone else, or like you're on another dimension of time or something. And you could also talk about post-mortem salvation, or you could talk about purgatory.
Mm-hmm.
So it just seems like that constraint is just not going to help the anti-universalist. So what do you think about that response to like, you can't have universalism if we have free will, or you can't guarantee universalism if we have free will?
Yeah. Yeah. So regarding your point about like the permissibility to withhold somebody's use of free will, given the nature of the consequences. Yeah, I definitely agree. And like, that's why I think general articulations of like the free will defense and things like that aren't quite right, because like, just because somebody can, like, it's better in some sense that somebody is libertarianly free to do the good or the evil. Seems like, yeah, you can still like prevent their evil from actually having lasting effects. What I'd want to say though is that given the consequences, that can be a significant error, but I think there's still going to be instances of co-opting someone's free will that will be like deontologically impermissible. And like instances of that I'd want to say is like, well, when you're, let's say, changing somebody's fundamental character or something like that, or like entering into a loving relationship. Like, I don't think that a loving relationship is proper if like one party is sort of like manipulating the other to make it so that they enter into that relationship of some sort. Now, you did bring up the case, well, like maybe God could just convince somebody, like God, here, let me give you this argument as to why you should like enter into eternal beatific vision with me. I for one, I guess maybe like my understanding of rationality is, yeah, maybe a little bit more permissible in that like somebody could be given a series of reasons for something and still withhold actually abiding by what would be the best thing for them to do.
It's funny to be like, well, really this comes down to epistemic permissivism. Like, do you, like, okay, given the same set of information, could you come to multiple different rationally permissible conclusions? Right. It's like, okay, but I wasn't really imagining God like arguing you into a relationship. Okay. I was imagining him like convincing you to be in a personal relationship. Okay. Like by like reaching out to you. Maybe not at, like, I'm not even trying to get into the hiddenness argument, like maybe not at every single moment or something like that. Like he's always open to a relationship with you. Like, I don't need that for this. Like, it's just, like I said, he would know when to kind of reveal himself more to you. He would know when to give you space. Like, he would know how to like get you to voluntarily want to be in a relationship with him, because he's goodness itself, you know, or he's like perfectly loving, even if he's not goodness itself. So it's like, of course, any rational being is going to want to be in a relationship with him if they know what's good for themselves, but he doesn't want to force it, you know, and he's not going to argue you into it. So like, but I can still see how in the fullness of time, he could convince anyone who's rational to be in a relationship with him. Right. Yeah. So I wanted to bring this up because like, I think there are two good arguments for universalism, and both of them sort of map onto what you were saying there. Like,
an argument could be posed that a person only ever chooses the lesser of two goods due to some privation of knowledge or disorderly passion that they have. God, being all-knowing and all-powerful and all-good, would correct any lacks of knowledge or correct any disorderly passions that a person has and would offer his full love to all. So all shall be saved. So there's that sort of understanding that, like, the reason that somebody might reject God is because of, I don't know, some misconstrue of what God is. Like, you'll hear Christopher Hitchens sort of talk about how he doesn't want to be in heaven because he thinks of God as a sort of like horrible dictator,
like Big Brother kind of thing.
Yeah. And so, like, we could say that the Universalist could say that Christopher Hitchens has a misunderstanding of who God is. God is the good itself. Like, everything that is good within the world comes from God, or something like that. And it's because of God's willing it for it to occur. And so if you knew that God was like that, you would be like, oh, I do want to be around this person, actually. And so, yeah, given God's desire for all to be saved, he would provide everyone with all that information that they need in order to be in union with them. And I do want to say that, within Catholic teaching, there is this explicit teaching that, God does desire for the salvation of all. And so, some people have used that to sort of argue for universalism, even within Catholicism.
Like that, because that was something else that I thought needed to be argued for. Like, okay, God, because he's wise and all-knowing and omnipotent, like, he could be maximally convincing, not in like an argumentative sense, but like he knows how to like woo you into a relationship, or like how to make you realize that you, if you know what's good for you, you do want to be in a relationship with him, and not just because of the threat of the alternative or something. So, given that, I think that God could convince people. So the only thing it's missing is the motivation. But if that's just a Catholic teaching that he wants all to be saved, that answers that, I guess, at least for Catholics. But
right.
I mean, like, I agree with that argument where it's like, if you don't want to be in a relationship with a being of perfect love, then that is because you don't know what that means on some level, like, or because there's something like wrong with you. So it's either a lack of knowledge, or there's like, I think you said disordered passion or something. So I think that that's the kind of thing that could be fixed like over time, like, even if God doesn't want to just instantly be like, okay, we're done with that lack of knowledge and we're done with that disordered passion like instantly now. Okay, well, let's say that he wants you to naturally find that out yourself. Okay, or like naturally like kind of rectify that disordered passion yourself.
Sure.
Well, that could happen in like the fullness of time, so long as you don't think this is all over the second after our earthly lives. Like, the moment of death, that's it. No changes can be made. As long as you don't accept that, then all that stuff can be fixed, and God doesn't have to like, oh, there's some kind of evil overriding this kind of freedom, where he's just like changing your nature. And it's like, well, he doesn't have to do that. Like, there's plenty of time. Like, I mean, time goes on infinitely in the future. Right. So pretty sure there's plenty of time for you to rectify that lack of knowledge and for you to rectify that disordered passion. And God really wants you to be saved. So this is like Josh Rasmussen's argument, or part of it, where he's like, why wouldn't God give you infinite chances?
To
like, why would he say you have 900 chances, but no more?
Right. I was going to go into that. Yeah, that's the other like good argument for universalism that Josh Rasmussen will defend, as well as Eric Reitan. Yeah, he makes this case as well, that God would offer the fullness of his love to all and would never allow someone to cut themselves off from accessing his love. Given an infinite amount of time, whatever is possible will eventually become actual, so all shall eventually be saved. I guess that second premise is maybe a little bit too strong. It's just, given an infinite amount of chances, somebody will eventually, become. And like, given an infinite amount of chances, and if one of those chances is like non-reversible, then eventually all shall be saved. And like, I'm not sure I buy the idea that given an infinite amount of time, any possibility shall become actual.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I never understood why people said that sort of thing. Like, well, just given infinite time, everything that can happen will happen. Like, some people have that intuition really strongly.
Yeah.
And like, I'm not saying I think it's wrong. I'm just saying whatever they're seeing, I'm like not seeing it.
Yeah. Cause like, I don't know, you can imagine, like, I've raised this example before. Like, suppose I have a coin that I'm flipping, and you could say that even if I've been flipping an infinite amount of times, there's going to be some far end of the distribution of possibilities there to where, like, technically I've only been ever flipping it to be tails this whole time, which is like super implausible or super unlikely. But because it's unlikely doesn't mean it's like impossible. And I think there is this sort of idea that like anything super duper unlikely is just not ever going to be the case. And yeah, maybe Eric Reitan will take a weaker form of universalism to say that, like, look, sure, it's possible that there are some that are not saved at all, but it's just super duper unlikely in the same sense that it's like super duper unlikely to, having given an infinite amount of flips, to always have it land on tails.
Yeah, that's the same sense that I feel like hopeful universalists talk about, oh, it's possible. And like that's kind of why it annoys me so much, because it feels like they're saying, well, it's possible that I pick up that quarter and I flip a trillion tails in a row. And I'm like, who cares?
Yeah.
Like, that's not going to happen. You know that's not going to happen.
Yeah, and I can see how, like, yeah, to hope for something that's super duper implausible seems almost like irrational in a strong sense.
And annoying when it's like, I'm trying to make arguments for universalism, and they're like, well, I hope it's true. Like, yeah, me too. Who cares? Like,
I did want to go back and just sort of like provide that motivation on the Catholic side, because, like, yeah, by saying that God wants for all to be saved, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of Catholics like, well, I don't know about that. This is from the Catechism, paragraph 851. It is from God's love for all men that the Church in every age receives both the obligation and the vigor of her missionary dynamism. For the love of Christ urges us on. Indeed, God desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. That is, God wills the salvation of everyone through the knowledge of the truth. Salvation is found in the truth. Those who obey the prompting of the Spirit of truth are already on the way to salvation. But the Church in whom this truth has been entrusted must go out to meet their desire, so as to bring them to the truth. Because she believes in God's universal plan of salvation, the Church must be missionary. So I think as a Catholic, you're committed to the view that God does desire for the salvation of all. And I think
it's stated literally, perfectly explicitly in the Catechism.
Yeah.
It's not even like subtext.
Yeah. And even if you're a theist, I think you should also say that, because, like, if you think that God is all good, well, what does all good mean? It means that, like, God desires for the good of all things. So, like, if the perfect good of all human beings is going to be in perfect union with God, then God's going to will for that goodness for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, based Vatican II Annihilator 1488 is in shambles right now. Yeah, everyone... Why are the converts always like that? I mean, like, this is like a theme that's popped up. This is not like an original observation, but plenty of people have pointed out that, like, the converts to Catholicism seem like a lot more extreme and a lot more like on the tradcath end of the spectrum, the stuff that seems like internet brain damage to me. And then, like, the people who are lifelong Catholics are typically not like that.
Yeah, I mean, probably because, like, there's this sort of cultural component to Catholicism, to where, like, people that are raised in it, it's almost like being Jewish in a sort of sense that, like, yeah, I'm Jewish, but then, like, how much do I need to know about my Jewish...
No, but, like, even committed Catholics, like, if they're raised Catholic, they seem to just not have the same kind of weird, like, Trent Horn comes into conflict with these people all the time, too, like the base trad accounts or whatever.
Right.
Like,
yeah,
I don't know why. Well, okay, so that's one argument against universalism annihilated and debunked.
The fact that there are all these tradcath accounts that, like, deserve eternal hellfire.
Oh, yeah, I was talking about the free will thing, but no, I just mean the idea that, like, well, you know, if you have free will, you can't really say universalism, like, and it's like, I don't agree with that at all, which I guess maybe I should say something about why do I care about this at all, because I don't even think God exists.
Yeah, so then your recent interest in universalism, is that just from your desire to, like, try to think about the best form of theism to hold in your mind? That way you're actually engaging with, like, what is the most plausible form of this position I disagree with? And so that most plausible form of theism is going to include some sort of universal salvation.
Yeah, that's one reason, because I mean I engage with universalism for the same reason I engage with Christians who believe in evolution as opposed to young earth creationism. It is the same exact motivation. So, like, it's just kind of annoying to me, first of all, when I'm, like, trying to engage the best version of a view, and then Christians will, like, yell at me for doing that. And I'm like, okay, I'm trying to be charitable to you. I'm trying to, like, deal with the best and not the worst version, because you really can't understand how implausible I think eternal conscious torment is.
Sure.
There is a 0% chance of that being true, at least understood in, like, this strong sense that we can get into.
Yeah.
And annihilationism is better, but that's because anything would be better. And, like, universalism is really it. Like, it's universalism or nothing. Another motivation is it is, like, the best possible way that the reality could turn out to be for everybody. So it's like, part of the reason I'm interested in theism is because it is kind of like the best possible outcome.
Yeah.
The reason I don't believe theism is true is because it is too good for the reality that we live in. Like, the world that we live in does not reflect the thought that, like, at the foundation, there's this being of, like, perfect goodness and power and all that. I just don't think that the world is good enough for that to make sense. Like, it just doesn't, what I know about the world, it just doesn't drive with that idea.
Sure.
So when I think about universalism, it's like, well, that does kind of salvage it a little bit, but okay, so it is like the best way reality could turn out to be, and a lot of people who are really smart take it seriously, and I want to be intellectually honest and look into it, not just be dismissive and everything. So the third reason is not really noble. It's not really like, well, I'm just being so charitable. You know, it's a shame people can't recognize what I'm doing. The third reason is more like, this is just like a covert way of making arguments against theism. Like, this is just a different approach to making the same arguments that I've been making my entire adult life as an atheist, which is like, here's one piece of the theistic picture, here's another piece of it, here's another piece of it. These cannot all be true. Like, this is like an inconsistent triad, or like this belief and that belief are not reconcilable. So like, when I talk about universalism, half the time I'm talking about like arguing against Christianity. Right. Because for most people, universalism is a no-go zone. They will never take it seriously at all. And if you argue for universalism, that is de facto arguing against Christianity. So like, sometimes I'm being charitable. I want to even say like half the time. Like, I'm earnestly exploring theism in its best forms. I'm not just going to reject the dumbest, worst forms of Christianity and theism and say, job done. I want to explore the best forms. I'm just making arguments against Christianity the other half the time. Like, I think that Christianity is internally incoherent. Like, if you really take seriously the view that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and Scripture forbids universalism, I'm like, oh, so Christianity is internally incoherent then. Like, once you take that, maybe there's more to it to draw out the incoherence. But like, I'm saying that belief about God, this kind of like maximalist omni-God, combine that with this view of Scripture where it's like, it is completely haram for Christians to believe in universalism. Maybe you need one or two other parts of the puzzle, but I'm saying like, these cannot be squared.
Sure.
So this is an argument against Christianity. It's just a different way of making the argument.
Yeah. No, that is interesting. Yeah, it's like specific to Christianity. It's like, look, universalism is the most plausible form of theism, but Christianity doesn't allow for that. So Christianity is much less plausible now.
Yeah. Like, if I say like, well, if you love someone very much, you will not have them tortured for all of time, and you will not even let them freely choose to be tortured. So if Christianity requires you to believe that, then it's asking you to believe this totally absurd thing that can't possibly be right. But like, Christianity does have the resources to just, that's a non-problem for David Bentley Hart. Like, it makes no sense. Like, if you think of God as a good father,
right,
the idea that he would let you walk towards this like infinitely deep pit of torture. I'm, on the one hand, exploring the more plausible forms of Christianity. On the other, I'm arguing against the less plausible forms of Christianity. But here's the thing, for a lot of people, that just is Christianity.
Sure.
Like, for some people, arguing against young earth creationism is equivalent to arguing against Christianity. And I'm saying for an even greater number of people, arguing against an eternal hell or eternal separation from God in every sense, or like in the worst senses, that is equivalent to arguing against Christianity. Well, that's what I do on this podcast. I argue against theism and against Christianity. So this is just kind of like a fun way of doing it.
Okay.
So I'm like accomplishing, I'm like, it's two birds with one stone.
Yeah. And if you wanted to also add in another thing, like maybe you think that, I don't know, helping people see the truth, even if they hold to other false beliefs, is like still better. Like, oh, you believe in theism, but you don't believe in universalism. But I think that if theism were true, then universalism would be true. I want to help you sort of like see that as well. Even though I don't believe in theism, I still want to sort of like help contribute towards our accepting of true beliefs now.
Yeah. I mean, that's like that's why I sometimes call myself a conditional universalist, where it's like, well, look, given the truth of theism and given the truth of Christianity, then universalism follows, or given theism plus whatever it is, then universalism follows. Because I don't know if it's just theism. I think like theism does raise the likelihood of something like an afterlife and a good afterlife as opposed to a bad one, which is kind of, you're in the ballpark of universalism there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. But similar to like your desire to, I don't know, deal with the strongest forms of the positions that you disagree with, I want to say that like universalists in responding to, in making their case for universalism, tend to go against the low-hanging fruit, in my opinion. Like they go towards the infernalist, the traditional view of hell, which is is like fair, given that like that's a majority of Christians do hold to that view, even at a sort of like lay level. But I think that like in order for universalists to maybe make a better case for their arguments, is like really standing up against the more plausible forms of infernalism or non-universalism that are out there. And so I'd want to throw out, just as a reference for people, there's this episode on Kyle Allender's channel, Christian Idealism, where myself, Caleb Cumberland, and him all came on to sort of talk about forms of hell that we find morally plausible, like ideas of, technically all the conditions of hell are technically met, in that like not everyone will be eternally saved, but it's still not awful. It's not just being raped in hell forever. It's like there's three different views that were put out there. Kyle's understanding of hell, and these are all sort of speculative, so we're open to changing on our opinions on them. Kyle's view of hell is a sort of restorative notion of hell, but not to the point of the beatific vision, but at least to a sort of natural happiness. People who die in a state of mortal sin will have to go through some sort of purgatorial transformation of character to the point that they can attain a happiness, but it's not a beatific happiness of the divine life of God, but it's just a sort of natural state of happiness that's there at the top level of hell, essentially. That's his,
I mean, how is that hell though? Like, you've achieved this state, you've gone through purgatory, and now you're in this state of eternal natural happiness. It's like, that just sounds like two-tiered universalism.
Sure. Yeah. You could say that. I think what would qualify it as not being hell, not being heaven and thereby being hell, is the fact that, well, it's eternal separation from God. Like, so in its fullness.
I guess if by heaven you mean the beatific vision and you mean full union with God, then not everyone's going to heaven. Yeah. But they're still going to end up in a state of natural happiness.
Right. Yeah. So that would be yeah. So I think that's a plausible form of hell, I guess you could say. And maybe it could be argued that that's technically a kind of universalism, because at least people's lives on the whole are for the good, or like a benefit to them, because they do attain a sort of natural state of happiness. It's just not a perfect happiness in union with God. So maybe for a lot of universalists, they would say, that's technically a type of universalism. That's a fair point, and maybe that's a point of sort of like convergence that could be made. My friend Caleb, he also made the case for a sort of semi-annihilationism, the idea that those in hell, their consciousness will sort of like, they'll be put in a sort of state of eternal slumber of some sort. And so that can make some sense as to like, well, why is it that the people in hell don't change their mind? It's like, well, they're not conscious, so that's why they can't change their mind. They're not awake or experiencing anything to have their mind changed about. And then my view,
why would you not just annihilate them? Like, why are they just going to sleep, and then are they dreaming, or is it like a dreamless sleep?
It could be like a dreaming sort of state, or completely absent of consciousness, but they're still existing. And I think the idea is like, he's sympathetic towards annihilationism as well, but there's a sort of idea, especially within Catholicism, that annihilationism is sort of off the table, given the idea that God wouldn't destroy immortal souls like us. And so they're still in existence, and so, but they're just not experiencing things for all of eternity.
I see. Okay, I didn't realize that was off the table, because annihilationism seems like the most scripturally supported view if you're just like reading through the New Testament, and like, I don't know, it just seems like annihilationism seems like the Christian view in the New Testament. I mean, it seems like the one that has the most prima facie scriptural support, to me at least.
There's like the verse in scripture that Jesus tells them, like, you fear those that can destroy the body, but you should fear those he who can destroy both the body and soul. And so that doesn't seem to like leave open the possibility, or maybe a sort of implicit threat there, that like the soul shall be annihilated, or at least that there's that possibility that's there. I think my like aversion towards annihilationism is similar to your like intuitions regarding universalism is that like fully loving to the individual to just let them pass out of existence?
Yeah, like if you ever love someone so much that you killed them for basically no reason, like it's like, look, they don't have to be in a state of like horrible agony.
Right.
They can just go on, like I'm currently not in a state of horrible agony and also not in heaven.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so you do not need to kill your children just because they're not going to be in the best state ever. You know, I'm just saying, like, there are not just two possibilities here, like the best state ever, the worst state ever. And it's just, God is just too loving to let you be in the worst state ever if you can't be in the best state ever. So he's going to kill you. Yeah. It's like, okay, two things wrong with that. One, it makes no sense to kill someone because you love them so much, unless they are in like, you know, some kind of horrible state of agony and there's no possibility for ending it or something like that. The only out is death. Then like, yeah, like if you've ever seen like a war movie where someone's like on fire and then they like shoot themselves or their friend shoots them or something like that. Like, yeah, that makes sense. But like God has more options than that. So like it just, annihilationism just makes no sense on those grounds. But also just the idea that it's really on the whole good to have someone miss out on an eternity of bliss, because it's not just that you are avoiding this bad thing. It's like you are also missing out on this good thing, which I think is something like that needs to be justified. Like if you can have some kind of wonderful outcome at basically no cost to you, then why you're not doing that needs to be justified. Like if you're going to the trouble of like annihilating souls, or like you're resurrecting them so you can annihilate them, or whatever the annihilationist view is, if you're going to all that trouble, that, you know, needs to be justified. Like why are you causing them to miss out on an eternity of bliss, or causing them to miss out on an eternity of at least not torment? It's like these are all coherent options that are on the table and you're choosing to kill them. It's like, what justifies that? Like it's bad because they're missing out on this good thing. And I just don't see like the motivation for doing it.
And then just to finish it, the view that I sort of laid out, I call the inhibitory model of hell, which is the idea that like sin or like moral error is something that corrupts the individual that's performing that sin, to the point that people who live out a life of sin will basically be corrupting their own nature to some extent, to the point that like, yeah, God will retain them in existence, but will, I guess, diminish their faculties to the point that they are no longer recognizably human, I guess you could say, or no longer recognizably human in the sense of being a rational animal. Their like moral faculties have been like deprived. That way, they're no longer capable of sin. They basically become a moral patient at that point. And I guess the idea for that is like, well, say, yeah, somebody is just perfectly willing to corrupt their moral character to the point of being an evil person. That's not the sort of thing that you should, like, if you love that person, you wouldn't want them to continue having that sort of moral character. And yeah, like, it would be great to reform their moral character, but if you, like, respect their autonomy and, like, think that, like, oh, they don't want to undergo a significant amount of moral reform, I should still try to provide for them a happy life, but I don't want to provide them with happiness in this sort of state of moral error. To like, if you like make somebody who is like Ted Bundy, like perfectly happy in their current like attitudes towards the world, that's like doing a bad thing. But if you were to like deprive Ted Bundy of his reasoning capabilities and provide him like a simple life of happiness as like a chimpanzee or something like that, then that's like you're still benefiting them in some respects. So the idea on the inhibitory model of hell is that, yeah, sin does corrupt us. Like there's a sort of Aristotelian virtue ethics idea that like you become how you behave, or you become what you practice. And so people that practice moral iniquity become non-human in a sort of sense. Like if you are a rational animal and you continually act outside of what would be rational for you to do, you become inhuman in a true sense. So yeah, that's a view of hell that I guess it's similar to the limbo view of hell, but maybe like a step lower, because the idea of limbo is that like in your current state as a rational human being, you can attain a sort of natural happiness. But like for the damned, they like undergo a significant devolution to where they're no longer a rational individual, but they are more like an animal. And I think that that animal can enjoy a life of happiness in, let's say, like the new heavens or the new earth. But it's not a sort of happiness that is it's not the beatific vision. Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to bring those up because like I think that universalists in their sort of like rational and fair criticisms of infernalism don't engage with the most morally plausible views of hell that I think are still on offer. Like I think the case for universalism is a lot stronger if it's just, okay, eternal torture versus universalism. Universalism seems like obviously the way to go. Mm-hmm. But if it's like universalism versus one of these three options, it's like, well, I mean, I can see how universalism is better, but it's not necessarily like as obvious as like, oh, well, that must be the case. And so I'd like to see universalists actually engaging with more nuanced conceptions of hell than just what's sort of out there at a lay level.
Yeah. But the strong view of hell that we're like kind of agreeing is like really implausible. Someone laid it out once as like 4 theses. Hang on, let me look it up real quick.
Yeah. So
the strong view of hell is 1, the anti-universalism thesis. Some persons are consigned to hell. 2, the existence thesis. Hell is a place where people exist if they're consigned there. 3, the no escape thesis. There's no possibility of leaving hell and nothing one can do to change or become in order to get out of hell once one is consigned there. And 4, the retribution thesis. The justification for hell is retributive in nature, hell being constituted to mete out punishment to those whose earthly lives and behavior warrant it. So some people go there. It's a place where people exist, and you cannot escape. There's nothing you can do or change or become to get out there, to get out of there once you're there. And you're there for like retributive reasons. But anyway, so it's bad. You can't get out. Some people are there. So that's like the strongest view of hell that's like on offer. And yeah, that is the one where it's just like, if you can't see how there might be a tension between like standard theistic beliefs and that, then it can be spelled out for you, like in That All Shall Be Saved, or like Andrew Horonich's book, or like other universalist works. Yeah, I mean that's the kind of view where you're saying like, yeah, we get it, like that's not true, but that's not the only view of hell that's out there. Like there are weaker views, like C.S. Lewis's view, where you are free to like C.S. Lewis's view rejects the no escape thesis, and like the 3 views you outlined reject one or more of those theses that the strong view accepts. So it's like there are better views of hell, and if universalists want to be convincing, then you can't just beat up on the strong view of hell. And I mean, to be fair to universalists, they do engage with it. It's just like when you start looking at it online, it's just like a disproportionate amount of time is spent on like these ridiculous maximalist versions of hell, which to be fair, lots of people believe in that kind of hell. So like it's worth doing, but it's really, if you ever want to take the next step, like it's there in the literature, but it just seems like in podcasts and like on YouTube and stuff, universalists are typically not going that far beyond like you spend all your time arguing against like a very strong version of hell, and then you say a couple words about annihilationism, and then like that's how most of those podcasts go. Yeah,
especially since as you were bringing up, like, well, straightforward reading of scripture, you can definitely get a sort of annihilationist reading of hell out of it. And I do think that a lot of Protestants nowadays are much more lenient towards annihilationism as their conception of hell, especially if they have like thought about it at all, like recognizing, oh wait, actually eternal conscious torment does sound kind of bad, and I don't know if I'd want to worship a God that does prescribe people
just like that. Like David Bentley Hart made this point to me first, and I guess other people have said it, but it clicked with me first with him, where he's like, look, over and over again we're told in Christian scripture and tradition that like we're supposed to view God as kind of a father figure, like our relationship to God is kind of like that of a father. So if you try to think about like what would a good father do, and what would he not do, then the strong view of hell is just completely off the table. Like Josh Rasmussen gave this one analogy where he's like, imagine a playground where there's a big pit at the middle of the playground and it's infinitely deep, and you think like, oh, well, do I have to respect the free will of my children, who like don't really even understand the consequences of what they're doing, because how could they? Yeah. It's like, so are you going to like let them play around the pit and maybe even fall in the pit and just let them fall forever? Or are you going to board the pit up? Even like maybe you let them fall in, but then you yank them out. Just the idea that like some kind of free will response is sufficient to be like, let the kids play around the infinite pit. It's like, no, a good father would not do that, obviously. And then there's just, there's all this other scriptural justification, like the prodigal son, or like the book of Jonah, where it just seems like, at least to me, there's just such an unambiguously like universalist message, or at least like the doors are always open message, like a rejection of like the no escape thesis. Jonah, I think, is just about people who reject universalism, but the prodigal son thing is like, you know.
Oh yeah, so like Jonah would be the Thomas in heaven, like frustrated that like, well, these people are like saved when you were supposed to punish them. Yeah.
No, because God saves all these bad people at the end who don't deserve it.
Right.
And then Jonah is so disturbed by the idea that there's grace and that he like saved people who didn't deserve it. He's so upset by this that he's like wailing, and he's like, it would be better if I was dead right now, like just throwing a temper tantrum. And it's just like, when you listen to the reactions of Christians to universalism, it's like, that is it. They are exactly Jonah, wishing for the destruction of like other people. They're like, God, I want you to die. Like, I want you to suffer. And then they're really upset that God forgives bad people. And it's just like, I feel like that's just like Sunday school Christianity. Like, we don't deserve it. And then God saves us anyway, even though we don't deserve it. Like, that's what I was taught. And then like the objection to universalism is often like, well, what the hell? You don't deserve it. You didn't.
I will not stand idly by while you portray God as some sort of all-forgiving monster.
What they said is illegal, or ought to be. What is his real name? Bob Odenkirk. I was about to say Saul. I love Saul. No, or like Andrew Haranich told me this story, like when I interviewed him, where he's like, you know, all these people are at the pearly gates and they're about to get let in because they said the magic words, and they have their Willy Wonka golden ticket, like getting into heaven. And then it's announced that, you know, basically like the story of Jonah, like all these like bad people, like everyone you ever met is going to be also led into heaven. And they start wailing and crying and gnashing their teeth. And then like, it turns out that just is hell. Yeah. It's just like taking the anti-universalists and telling them universalism is true. And then their reaction is hell. That's just what it is.
So hell is just for all the people frustrated about how everyone's saved.
Frustrated by universalism.
Yeah. No, there's that other parable as well that Christ gives, talking about the different workers, the wages that were all given. Mm-hmm. Like they were all given the same wages, even though they worked a different amount of times, and then they were like given in the wrong order, to where like the people that were there first, they were paid their normal wage, and then by the end, like, oh, I worked longer, I should get a higher wage, even though we agreed to this beforehand. And then they get frustrated by the fact that like, hey, these guys just came in out of the like what at the end of the of the day, and they only worked an hour, but yet they're still paid the same as me. That's not fair. I'm mad.
And like the prodigal son, like he had a brother who was mad that their father was throwing a big party, and he's like, I never left and spent all your money and like embarrassed you and like did all this stuff, and like you didn't throw a party for me. And then like the father has a justification for that, but it's like, that's like a consistent theme in scripture, is like not just that we're supposed to view God as a father, but that like he saves people who don't deserve it, and then people who feel they don't deserve it either, but they feel like they deserve it more than those other assholes, they get really indignant about it. Like, that's like a consistent theme. Okay, so there are obviously a ton of arguments for universalism that we have not covered. There were just a few points that I wanted to raise with you, because there are things we've talked about before. But you are not a universalist.
Right.
So, I mean, what are your reasons for rejecting the truth of universalism?
Yeah. So I will say, like, I come from a background tradition, and in being connected to that tradition, I want to hold it up and respect its teachings. And so there is a sense in which, like, if I wasn't like Catholic, if I was just some like general theist, I could see how I have no prior commitments or anything like that, and have no like dogmas that I'm trying to defend or anything like that. And so like I could see why I might defend universalism or something like that. But in thinking of God's like connection to the human race and like revealing things to them, I'd want to, I don't know, try to defend what I think that God has sort of taught the church, and in thinking that Christ sort of like works within the church through history. The Catholic Church has not accepted universalism, and that doesn't automatically mean that universalism must be false. It could very well still be the case. It would just be kind of unlikely if it were true. And that's not a reason.
Not just because you're like, you know, betting on Catholicism being true. Catholicism has not like ruled out universalism.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it hasn't affirmed it, but it hasn't said that you can't believe it either.
Yeah. Yeah. If you take the tradition as like, even though it's not like dogmatic, given the fact that like a significant amount of the tradition has not treated universalism as like what's possibly or probably the case, that could give you reason to think, oh, this is maybe not part of the tradition. And now that gives you no reason because you're not Catholic. You don't give a shit like what, oh, if Catholicism teaches like universalism is false, well, then Catholicism is probably false. I just wanted to bring up, that's like a component to like my thinking. And I want to sort of defend the church's teaching in this regard. Yeah. But I also I think there's philosophical reasons to reject universalism as well.
There are no such reasons. But just to be clear, the primary reason is tradition and scripture, right?
I think that like, I have a sort of commitment to defending the teachings of the church, and one of those teachings is like, by my lights, not universalism. So I want to like make a case for why not universalism is a plausible view.
You didn't mention scripture though. Is that not a part of it?
Yeah, that would be part of it as well. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Catholic, you don't care about that. But so because the thing is, the most common answer is like, yeah, I can see like some of the force of these arguments, but like, the scriptural data, quote unquote, is like incompatible. But yeah, I mean, the scripture is like the biggest hindrance for, I mean, everyone who I've talked to about universalism, where you eventually start to wear them down, they're like, okay, but it is clearly not unambiguously affirmed in scripture. Everybody should be able to admit to that. It's not unambiguously affirmed. And some people think it's just outright, rejected in scripture. Sometimes they say like Jesus said it's not true. So scripture and tradition are basically like the two most common reasons. And sometimes you get these pathetic philosophical arguments against universalism, which I think you're about to.
Go Let me get into one of them. So yeah, I want to sort of like start from an understanding of like what love is, and thinking that God is all loving and is love itself. There's a sort of ethical component to love that you cannot like force someone into a sort of loving relationship. And so in order to be in a loving union with someone, that must be done like consensually between both parties. And if universalism was true, I would think that because the impetus for love doesn't come from the individual that is in a state of mortal sin, it would have to come from God. And so there is a sense in which like, that's a sort of manipulation on God's part to like make them into the sort of person that wants to love God now. And that, by my lights, is a sort of like unethical use of power on God's part. Like, I think I can agree that God could change someone's character so that they desired to be in perfect union with God. But if that person had already sort of explicitly stated or taken the position that they don't want to be in that sort of union, then how ethical is that for God to put them through some situation or circumstances to where like, oh, you didn't want to do this, but I'm going to make it so now you do want to. And so there's a sort of like ethical concern for at least some forms of universalism. I think there's other forms that might not fall into this domain, but at least like a sort of lay level understanding of universalism, I think that this argument might abide or apply to.
So I feel like that was already kind of answered with the free will stuff, because, I mean, do you think it would be unethical for me to like prevent you from leaving your apartment or your house? Like I just say, no, you can't do what you want. Well, yeah, that would seem wrong for me to just be like, no, you can't do that. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, but if I have knowledge that you don't have, then it can be justified for me to like do something that would, all else equal. Yeah, that would be wrong for me to do that. But I know something that you don't know. There's a serial killer who's like trying to track you down, and he's right outside. And if you go outside, then you're going to, fall into his clutches. And it's like, okay, well, that's information I have that you don't have. Mm-hmm. So I think it would be totally fine for me to like kind of override your will on that, because you just don't know what's good for you. And once that deficiency of your knowledge is filled in, you'd be like, thank you. You wouldn't be like, oh, I'm resentful that you did this or something. You'd be like, it's a deficiency of your knowledge. And if you, for some reason, if that lack of knowledge can't be rectified, then I'm totally within my rights to just override your will. But I don't know why I wouldn't just rectify the lack of knowledge. Yeah. Like, you're rational. I can just say, there's someone trying to kill you out there. Don't go out there. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't have to stop you. I would just tell you that information. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying, like, if some rational being is like, I don't want to be in a relationship with God, who is a being of perfect love. Yeah. They don't know what they're talking about. A being of perfect love and rational being. I mean, those are kind of the two important components there. Yeah. You're a rational being, and you're saying, I don't want to be in a relationship with a being of perfect love. Well, that's either because you're lacking some kind of information or knowledge, which could be rectified, and I don't see what's immoral about forcing that knowledge on you.
Mm-hmm.
And if it for whatever reason, if it's important that you figure it out for yourself, then okay, you can figure it out for yourself eventually. Why is that not possible? So I feel like God could force that information on me, and I could also come by it by my own lights. I mean, like, either way, I could come by this information, like, it's forced on me, or I figure it out for myself in the fullness of time. Either way, this deficiency of knowledge and information could totally be filled in. And then I would see, oh, well, I just don't know. When I said I didn't want to be in a relationship with God, it was because there was something I just didn't know.
Right.
And if it's not that, then it seems like, you used that phrase earlier, like disordered passions or something. Yeah. It's like, okay, well, that's kind of like a deficiency in your character.
Right.
And it seems like that can be something that can be rectified, again, either by God or by you, like with enough time and with enough moral development, like a purgatorial kind of hell. Like, again, this is a standard universalist position. Like, purgatory is for fixing that stuff about you, Yeah. I mean, to put it like kind of crudely.
Right.
Like, if it is something to do with your character and your nature and like your heart, well, then isn't that what purgatory is for? Like, that's the point of it. So I'm saying, like, if it's some deficiency within you, whether it's knowledge or intellect or something like moral, like something about your character, those are all deficiencies that can be rectified in purgatory, which is the standard universalist view of like hell is kind of a purgatorial state or place or whatever.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, given all that, I just don't see the force of this at all.
Okay. Yeah, I can definitely get how if you're preventing somebody from falling into like a deep, dark pit or like being killed by a serial killer or something like that, then yeah, you can inhibit their will to some extent and hopefully, or just tell them, hey, don't do that. And if they're like, they don't believe you or something like that, then it makes sense to like, okay, well, don't do that because I know that this is not going to be for the best for you. It's going to be really bad for you and things like that. Models of hell that aren't like horrible, like tormentful suffering for all of eternity. Maybe that sort of analogy won't be as applicable because like, oh, you're not going to enjoy the beatific vision. You're not going to enjoy the deepest state of happiness. I'm going to now co-opt your will so that you will learn to want to be in that state.
Well, when you say co-opt your will, I think it's important to be like, okay, what exactly is happening? Well, like you said, there's some disordered passion. Like there's something about your character that is deficient. Like maybe you're like too selfish or something.
Sure.
Or I don't know, you could like desire, hurting other people or something like that. I think that, morally normal like adults can see what's wrong with that sort of thing. And I think it's just kind of standard moral development to just be like, to be able to change for the better and then look back on it and be like, wow, that was not good when I was like that. And I just don't see why there's some kind of hard limit here where it's like, well, yeah, I mean, you have some kind of character flaw or something and God is effectively just going to give up on you or something because that would be co-opting your will. Like it sounds like what's necessary is just moral development.
Yeah.
And I mean, what's the cutoff point? Because all that's really required is moral development, not co-opting your will and kind of like taking you over like a robot or something.
Yeah.
It's like, no, it's just needed is some more moral development. And the way that you get that, we're pretty familiar with. It's like there are friends and family and like mentors and like exemplars. Like there are people who inspire you to be better. I'm just saying like, I don't see why the course of moral development on Christianity would have to like suddenly stop at the moment of death.
Sure. Yeah.
Why couldn't it continue?
Yeah.
And then if moral development can continue after death and could potentially go on like infinitely, I just don't see why this is like an objection where you're like, well, there's some deficiency in your character. It's like, okay, well then they need more moral development, which we have plenty of time for.
Yeah. No, yeah. Being somebody who subscribes to the doctrine of purgatory, I do think that, there can be and is a significant amount of time that can be had even after death to sort of reform a person's character so that they can enjoy the beatific vision in its fullness. Because like if somebody was imperfect in their prior to death, they're not going to be able to enjoy a perfect life with God. So they'll have to undergo some sort of change in some regard. But I'm more concerned with like the ethical duties God has towards those individuals that aren't wanting to go through that sort of change. And you could say, oh, the reason that they don't want to go through that sort of change is some sort of deficiency in them. They're not responsible for that deficiency in them. So that's something that God should like correct in them.
Or not, he doesn't even have to do it. That's like one thing. Because like I said, I think it's fine if he does that.
Yeah.
But I'm saying if you, for some reason, don't think it's fine, I think he can create the conditions where we can figure this out for ourselves.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's really good, because I was thinking about Andrew Hronich's sort of...
Okay. Yeah.
I was thinking about Andrew's sort of view of hell, where he'll sometimes like say things like, oh no, my view of hell is much worse than most like infernalists' view of hell, because I think that like hell is like the worst possible experience that one can undergo, because you're like fully understanding the depths of the depravity of sin and things like that, and that's enough to sort of like change you and scare you straight, essentially, things like that. And like there's a ethical qualm I have with that, in that like God's basically putting you through these series of experiences that are torturous. Like,
oh, he would never do that.
Well,
except for all of eternity, if you don't say that. Anyway, sorry for attacking the strong view of hell, but like you're saying God would never do a thing that like practically everyone who's listening and disagreeing with everything I'm saying, they're like, that is literally what they think he is going to do. You're saying like we can't co-opt your will, you can't make him go through a torturous experience. It's like, and that's why I affirm eternal conscious torment, where people are in a place eternally with no escape against their will, where they're tortured for all of time. Because I don't know, it just seems like a lot of anti-universalists suddenly become like very like sentimental and like squishy and like, oh my God, they're so like, they're so delicate and morally sensitive to all these minute little concerns, where they like don't give a fuck. Like 2 seconds later, as soon as you say, yeah, but what about, you know, these people like being tortured for all time? And they're like, good, they deserve it. And then like, again, you start talking about like, well, what if God kind of like, you know, fixed some deficiency in their knowledge? You're like, well, that would be such a horrible wrong. He simply couldn't do that.
No, I think, your point though is like very good, in that like if the only means for God to sort of reform somebody's character was through this sort of like horrible, tortuous experience, then I could like see some ethical qualms with that. But you're bringing up like, well, maybe that's not really necessary. Maybe all that's really necessary is like put them in timeout for a bit till they recognize...
I'm just really saying, like, what you're saying could not be uttered by someone who's defending eternal conscious torment.
Sure.
Like, this cannot be an objection to the universalist view if you're defending eternal conscious torment.
Unless you hold to, like, a weird sort of view that, like, oh, maybe torture is bad if it's, like, for some corrective purpose.
Wait, so you can't make him do this if it's for, like, restorative corrective purposes, but if it's just pure endless retribution, then it's totally fine. That's absolutely.
Because like torture, what it is, when like torture is actually being employed, it's because like, oh, this person has information that I want, and I'm going to torture them until I get that information. And so there's like a need or a desire that I have, an end that I have in mind, and I'm going to like use your suffering as a means to get that end.
Or what about, I mean, first of all, I'm totally fine with retribution. Like, I am kind of a retributivist, and like I do think that people can deserve punishment at least. I think it's totally bizarre that some people deny that like some people just deserve punishment, you know, and like it's better if they're punished than if they're not punished. So like this isn't like, my universalism isn't coming from like some squishy like restorative justice position where I like am just so anti-retributivist. But I mean, first of all, like Eric Wrighton points out, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, is like a Christian view of forgiveness does seem to be kind of implicitly restorative. First of all, the point about like torturing someone for restorative reasons. Okay, maybe just take torture off the table and just say like, is it okay to punish someone for restorative reasons? Yes, obviously. Like people who are for restorative justice think punishment can be okay if it's like for the right purpose, you know, like if it's for like some kind of reconciliation or like bringing people back into union or whatever it is. Like there are different brands of like restorative justice, but like they think punishment can be justified. Or like, you know, as Dr. Wrighton was describing it, it seemed like he was saying like punishment can be justified like if it's towards this purpose of like reintegration of like the body of Christ or something. Like if you're trying to like heal things and restore things back so people are in a right relationship with each other. Punishment can be justified for restorative. Well, who would, even retributivists don't deny that. Like, it's okay to punish people for restorative purposes. Nobody denies that.
Okay. Yeah. So there can be like minimal amounts of, it's not torture, but it is a sort of negative experience.
It is punishment, though.
Yeah, it is punishment. Yeah. Okay. So just while we're on that sort of topic of restorationist versus retributivist understandings of justice, one of the premises in the argument for universalism that I brought up earlier seems like it would basically remove any occasions for retribution in the world. So like we'd say that, the only reasons that somebody would reject universal salvation, personal salvation, is because there's some sort of lack of knowledge on their part, or maybe some sort of like flaw of moral character at that point. And these are things that they're not responsible for. These are things that...
Oh, it sounds like Galen Strawson just in the chat over here.
Yeah, well, I mean, any sort of... If they are responsible for it, then like maybe it wouldn't be appropriate to provide them with that. And so it seems like certain universalists, like strong universalist views, almost make it the case that like, if any time somebody sins is because of some sort of lack of knowledge on their part, or maybe because they were like built partially immorally, then in what way can anybody's sin be like their own fault? Really, it's almost like,
who am I talking to right now? It seems like it seems like I'm talking to Galen Strawson arguing that nobody's responsible for the way they are. I thought you're like, is this the thing you're defending, or are you okay?
I'm saying that like on universalist accounts, it seems like there's not the space for retributivism. So like on David Bentley Hart's sort of more Gnostic sort of approach to universalism, he has the idea that like we're created in a sort of imperfect state. I think he thinks that just because of classical theism is true, or some form of classical theism, anything that's not God is going to be initially imperfect. And that's not something that it's their fault. They're just like built kind of shitty.
Yeah. No, like in That All Shall Be Saved, he spends a lot of time talking about like, yes, we have free will, but like it seems like the kind of freedom that some of these people are relying on is a kind of freedom that we could not possibly have. Like you can't really be... He does sound a little bit like Galen Strawson when he's making that argument from like the impossibility of being like ultimately responsible for your own nature or something like that. Yeah, I mean, because I was going to say, I was like, I don't think the universalist case hinges on that. But yeah, I forgot that at least Hart does... He does make some comments about free will in That All Shall Be Saved that are like to that effect. Like there's some kind of freedom that these people are assuming that we have that like you can't have that freedom, even though he does believe in free will.
Yeah, and that's where like it almost mitigates not just, somebody chooses not to be in personal salvation with Christ, but also like any sort of sin that they might perform. It's like hard to say that they're responsible for that. And so if they're not like truly responsible for their sin because they were just created kind of shitty, either in lack of knowledge or lack of moral character, how can it be just to like punish them to sort of get them to that point? Like I do think that punitive justice makes sense when the person is responsible for the action that they performed. But if they're not responsible for it, then even any sort of punishment to them, maybe it will have like positive consequences, but like a perfectly moral being isn't just, I don't know, maybe in trying to like formulate a response specifically to you, then
well, because I'm the option that I take is that we like, obviously I'm like compatibilist pilled, and I'm just like I think that if you do something of your own free will, like you choose to do it, you kind of have some knowledge of what you're doing, and like it's bad, and like you're gonna, I think, deserve punishment for that if you do a bad thing intentionally and voluntarily and no one made you do it and that sort of thing. Like certain conditions are met, and it's like, okay, even if determinism is true, this still kind of like flowed from you and your will, and you should be punished for what you did because it was a bad thing. And I think that if you were like kind of an impartial agent, you could look at yourself, you could look at your own actions and be like, that was a bad thing, and of course I deserve punishment for that. Like you wouldn't even try to evade it. You'd be like, I kind of had that coming. At least this is just my view that I'm like spelling out. I'm not trying to argue for it or anything. I'm just saying, I think if you meet certain conditions, like you're doing it because you want to do it, just as a first approximation, you do some bad thing, it's bad, you did it because you wanted to do it. And I think like, if you're being honest, if you get punished for that, you're like, I kind of had that coming. Yeah. So I just don't think it's impermissible to punish people, even if like determinism is true.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Then I wanted to sort of hone in on that argument for universalism based upon like, for somebody to reject salvation must be due to some sort of ignorance on their part or some imperfection of character on their part.
Can I just add one thing to why I think that? So like, God is a perfectly loving being, he's this being of perfect goodness and love and whatever. And I'm saying like, we're rational beings.
Yeah.
And I think there is some connection between the rational and the good, which is why I think there's that connection. So if you're a perfectly rational being, it's not just about like self-interest. It's not just about like prudential rationality. I'm saying like there is some deep connection between like rationality and goodness in the way that a lot of like moral non-naturalists in metaethics think about rationality and goodness. So like if you're a rational being and you're concerned with the good, or you're thinking about like a perfectly good being or a being of perfect love or something like that, then like I just think it's unavoidable that you're going to, if you have perfect knowledge and understanding, want to be in a relationship with that being. No,
it's interesting because there's this view that I want to say Richard Swinburne holds. Is it motivational internalism or reasons internalism? That it's the view that like if you know what the good is, you will automatically be motivated to try to bring it about. So like that's his sort of like basis for saying that God is all good, is because, well, God's all knowing. And so he knows all of the reasons that are out there to do certain actions. And because he knows it intimately, he's also motivated to bring about that good thing. And so, I'd wonder how like somebody like Swinburne would respond to this sort of argument, because like if he thinks that, for the reasons that people aren't going to go to aren't going to go to heaven is because they're not motivated to seek the good, but that must mean that they're like ignorant of what the reasons are. And so
because I mean it would be sort of akin to being like, well, look, that little kid just chose to jump into the pit. It's like, it's a kid. They don't know what they're doing. Like they're so limited in their cognitive faculties. And it's like, obviously if that were rectified, they would not jump in the pit.
Yeah. So I wanted to sort of like explore with you like the full entailments of what it means to be a rational agent. Like, because it seems like in order for this argument to sort of go through, it almost requires that a rational agent, in recognizing what the better option would be, would naturally choose that better option. And I don't know if that's like a strict requirement to be rational. I would think that to be a rational agent would be to, when given the options between a good and a bad scenario, would be motivated to choose the good one. But if given an option between two good scenarios, it seems perfectly rational to me for them to choose either one, even if they recognize that one of those other scenarios is technically better. So like an example I can bring forward is like, consider prospective parents. They have the option of living in a world in which they have only one child, or living in a world in which they have two children. Now, the world in which they have two children is going to be objectively better because there's a second child and more good in the world. And let's say that like having a second child doesn't like diminish their I don't know, exhaustion or like level of energy and stuff like that. If they were to sort of recognize that and still choose to have only one child, I don't want to say that they're acting irrationally, even though they recognize this is a lesser good than what I could achieve. And it almost seems like in order for this argument for universalism to work out, is it requires that anyone given the option between greater or lesser goods will always have to choose the greater good. And I just want to explore with you, like, do you think that's sort of a requirement for this argument?
No, I don't think so. I think there are like, I've tried to express this just in passing, where it's like, I think that universalism can be kind of open-ended, where it basically just means not eternal conscious torment and not annihilationism. But as long as, I mean, like Mormons call themselves universalists and stuff, and like, their view, like they have like these three different like kingdoms of heaven. They're not all equally good. And the reason some people go into the lower kingdoms instead of the higher kingdom is because it just better suits their nature.
Right.
So like what's good for them is determined by their nature. Everyone is like, yeah, you're not going to enter the celestial kingdom. Like you wouldn't even like it if you did. You know, like you're just not cut out for that kind of thing. Like it wouldn't be good for you and it wouldn't be good for anyone else. Like you're fine where you are, you know, but like that doesn't mean there has to be like death or torture, you know, like it's just like different kinds of kingdoms of heaven. So I feel like universalism can accommodate that kind of thing. Like there can be multiple good options, even though there's the best option, like the beatific vision or theosis, like however you understand that. It's like, yeah, there's the best option, then there are other good options. And not everyone will end up with the best option. Maybe that's like a free choice, and maybe that's even the best thing for them given their nature and everything. But I just don't feel like that's a non-universalist view.
Okay.
Just to say, well, not everyone will experience the beatific vision or enter the celestial kingdom.
Okay.
I don't really see that as non-universalism. Like,
Right.
not really, you know?
Okay, so yeah, maybe like a minimal universalism is something like all lives are ultimately good, maybe, or something like that, to where like there's no life that is on the whole bad. Whereas it seems like on non-universalist pictures, that's generally the case. Like,
I think that's way too weak because like that. I feel like that's compatible with annihilationism.
Is it?
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of like somebody that like Hitler or something like that. Let's say he lived a life of evil and then maybe underwent some sort of torture and then was annihilated, like on a sort of annihilationist.
It is nihilistic, yes.
I wonder, would they like that? Would seem to say that Hitler's life on the whole wasn't ultimately good. It was like negative in a large extent. And I want to say that, well, universalists reject that sort of picture, and so that's why they'd want to say no, all lives, even Hitler, have on the whole will have a benevolent life or a good life.
But don't you think you could have an on the whole good life that still came to an end?
Yeah.
Well, then it's compatible with annihilationism, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then, because universalists think that all creatures will have an eternal good life.
They're not going to be killed at some point permanently and irreversibly, or go to sleep or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so like I know that there's some like atheistic sort of criticisms of eternal heaven from the idea that like, oh, it'll eventually become boring or something like that. Do you think that somebody could be a universalist and still think that, eventually people will be annihilated after they've gone through all of the versions of heaven that they find enjoyable?
No, okay. So this is wildly speculative, so I kind of am like hesitating. What were we talking about just a second ago? So like different good options, right? I think that like the God case is not going to be like any other example that you could give.
Okay.
So that's why it's just those kinds of analogies.
Like,
special pleading fallacy.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I mean, like, what's better than the beatific vision? Like a really good smoothie?
Yeah.
Like, it's just say like, well, what if you had a second smoothie? It's like, that's just not analogous to being like having the beatific vision versus not having it.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't think that those are perfectly like, I mean, you just can't really compare. If it is what Christians say it is, I mean, then it can't be compared to anything. I think it's true that a rational being can pick different options and still be like a rational being, whatever. Like, I think that you can have multiple things in front of you and like each of them can be rational for you to do, if that's your point. And like, the only thing is, I don't think that there's really an analogy between like, I can believe this thing, which is justified, or that thing, which is also justified. Like, yeah, I think that you can accept that, but I don't think that's analogous to being like, I can have the beatific vision, or I can just kind of float into space or something. Like, like I just don't think that really is, equivalent at all.
Yeah. Okay. So then, I think what I was like bringing this up to do with like, okay, there's this argument for universalism. And I think that the argument for universalism almost like implicitly presumes that a rational agent will choose the best option that is available to them.
And I'm trying to say it doesn't presume that, but even if it did, you'd be fine.
Yeah. Your point is that like, maybe that's false. And so maybe this argument doesn't go through, but that's still compatible with universalism. Yeah. Okay.
So do you want to hear my super speculative shit? Okay, so I was thinking like along the lines of Josh Rasmussen, like, well, if you're given infinite chances, like eventually you'll kind of do the thing that's best for you. Once you finally like have more knowledge and like you're a better person, like eventually you'll enter into a relationship with God willingly, and he'll probably have a hand in that. Like, I doubt that he would just like have nothing to do with that whatsoever, even if it's not like coercive. He would still have something to do with like wanting you to like draw nearer to him, or like seeking after you or something, like the one sheep that wanders away or something like that. So there's that. But I do think that like, in the fullness and eternity of, heaven or so like, here's something that bothers me that atheists will say sometimes, like heaven would get really boring. Like you'll be in perfect bliss and it will just get boring. I don't think it would get boring, but even if it did, I don't see why you'd be like prevented from leaving. And like, I think about, the idea of pre-existence sometimes, or the idea of like past lives. And I don't see any reason why time couldn't be infinite in both directions, where we are like in this kind of great story like Josh envisions. And like I can see it kind of not just going all in one direction, I guess. Like we could be on this progression towards heaven, and then we eventually over eons get there. And then maybe it would get boring, or maybe for some other reason we would leave and then end up eventually in a state like this. If it really is necessary for things to be changing in order for us not to be bored and like to not just, want to be annihilated, then like I can see people leaving heaven, like either to come to earth or to go to even other places. So when people talk about pre-existence or like, NDEs, where there are so many people who are like, I felt like I was returning to a place I'd been before. Like there are just all these little hints that like I don't necessarily take seriously, where I'm like, oh yeah, the Mormon idea of pre-existence. It's not like I'm adopting all these things. I'm just kind of speculating like, well, if Christianity is true or theism is true, and like, I don't think that is incompatible with pre-existence. It would kind of make more sense actually if the start of like our story was not like, 20 or 30 years ago. It would kind of make more sense to me if there wasn't that kind of absolute beginning. But anyway, it seems like if you're going to say there's all this development after our deaths and there's all this change and evolution, eventually when you get to this end point, I don't know if it makes sense to be like you would just be there for all of eternity and nothing would change. It's like, I don't know. Like, I mean, I put a very low probability on the idea that like heaven would be so boring eventually. Like I would want to leave. It's like, or I mean, let's just suppose that's true. Well, then, like, why couldn't you leave? And, like, how do you know that we're not in the middle of some story that began with you leaving heaven to begin with? Which, again, is what some people report in their NDE experiences. And then we left to come here for some reason. And I don't know why, because if we did do that, then we don't remember why or what was before this. And, I mean, I'm sort of just taking pretty standard Christian ideas about a lot of evolution and change after our deaths and just saying, like, well, why couldn't that also be true in the other direction of time? And why couldn't it be infinite in both directions of time? I mean, that kind of makes sense to me in some way, where like time is infinite and we're kind of going into different realms. I mean, if theism is true, the possibilities are really kind of endless, you know? And like, if we have this immaterial soul that is like, you're going to like go to purgatory and then you're going to get to heaven. It's like, well, why wouldn't there be something that happened after that? I just don't see any reason to rule it out.
No, it is interesting, and especially like I think within like a Hinduistic sort of cosmology, that's sort of like, as I understand it, the sort of picture of reincarnation. Like first there was like all the souls with God, and then they were in a sort of beatific vision of some sort, and then like some of those souls like after a while just decided like, I want to try something new, and so they became incarnate and then lived out a life of sin and different things like that, and like go through the sort of like reincarnation highs and lows of the human experience that are all out there before eventually returning back to it, that sort of state. That's not the Catholic view, of course. But yeah, I think you're right that like if theism is true, then that's certainly a possibility.
I don't know why I even thought of that. I can't remember which question you asked me that prompted
that's right. Okay, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, because we were talking about like, okay, what does it even mean for universalism to be true? And I was like under the impression that it's like maybe it's like eternal state of being in heaven. But if like what the picture that you sort of painted of like, oh, maybe it's not eternal necessarily, because like people can leave heaven and then maybe return to heaven and things like that.
Well, that's why I was saying minimally it's just not eternal conscious torment that you never escape from, and not annihilationism.
Okay.
Necessary for universalism is rejecting those two things. And I think universalists are free to believe this kind of speculative picture I'm painting about pre-existence, and then there was this pre-existence, and then like after our deaths there's going to be all these further changes, and who knows how long they could go on, for trillions and trillions of years before you get to heaven, and then you spend trillions and trillions of years in heaven. And then I'm just saying, maybe on like after a Googleplex years in heaven, maybe you leave for a little while.
Right,
Like, I don't know. It just doesn't seem that crazy to me, and like, I don't understand why God would say no. Like, why not? I mean, especially if you're going on about like how important it is for God not to stop our, free choices.
No, yeah.
Even if it's like, I don't know, like, especially if it's not all just about, I don't know, like sort of one dimension of goodness, but if there are other dimensions of goodness too, like aesthetic goodness, then I can kind of see why people might leave heaven.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay, so then sort of tied back to, or looping back around to the notion of rationality is, so for somebody to like actively choose not to undergo a significant moral reformation so that they do become a perfectly moral character, do you think that sort of decision is going to be irrational for them to do? Or is it something that could be in line with rationality, given that like both options are technically good for them in some sense, even though one is obviously much better for them?
I mean, I think if you don't want to improve, I mean, you said become a like perfect person. It's like, well, I mean, I never think about that because it's not attainable. At least it's not really, like I can't imagine attaining it. So like I never even think about that. But if you're just talking about like, do you like, you think about something about yourself that you think is bad or don't like, it's like, do you want to change that? And are you being irrational if you don't want to change that? It's like, yeah, I think you're being kind of irrational if you don't want to change something, some flaw within yourself.
Okay. Yeah.
It might not come all at once. I'm just saying like piecemeal, like you notice something about yourself that's like not good and you're like, I wish I didn't do that, or I wish I wasn't like that.
Yeah. And so if somebody recognized a flaw within themselves in their moral character or something like that and was like perfectly content with living out the rest of their life with that flaw, you'd be like, they're acting irrationally because that's not something that a rational person would do.
I mean, I guess all else equal, they should want to fix that, you know? I mean, if you understand that it's bad and that you have reason to not do it and like it would be better if you did this other thing, then like, and you just never even, I mean, like, I'm assuming it's like attainable, you know? If it's totally unattainable, then like, you know, that would be something else to consider. Right. But like, if it seems kind of attainable, then like, why wouldn't you do it, you know?
Yeah.
And if you didn't, it would almost seem like maybe you need like I don't know, different friends or like different examples, or like you need some moral inspiration or motivation or something like, but yeah, it does seem like a deficiency in some sense. I don't know if it's strictly irrational, but I'm very tempted to say it's irrational.
Okay. Yeah. Because I do think that like, I don't know, maybe the strong divide between universalists and non-universalists is going to be, according to our like our notion of like sin in some respects, to where like it seems like what is it called, like the Socratic understanding of failure or moral failure is going to be due to some sort of ignorance or privation of character in some regards. But
why is that the Socratic?
Because like Socrates, or at least Socrates as the mouthpiece for Plato, sort of held that if you perceive the good as it is, you will automatically be inclined towards obtaining it. And so his whole understanding of people do things that are wrong, not because of some sort of like failure on their parts. It's due to like a lack of knowledge. And that's why he had this sort of like, I don't know, optimistic view that like, oh, if we can just teach people to become good people, like I can like show them their flaw in reasoning, and then from that they'll be able to be a good person now, which is great. And it is like there's something to that, in that like, a lot of times people do things without thinking about it. And if people were to think about it, then they'd probably be a lot more good people out in the world. And then maybe on the non-universalist camp, there's maybe more of a acceptance of a sort of Aristotelian understanding, to where, people will still act out of ignorance, but it's not an ignorance that's they're not responsible for. Like there can be occasions to where you do something wrong, and the reason that you did it was because you neglected to know the correct thing. So like maybe an example is like, oh, you brought back the car to your dad's, but you didn't bring it back with like a full tank, but you never checked the fuel gauge to know whether it was full or empty. And so you could be said to do something wrong out of ignorance, but it's an ignorance that you're culpable for. And I think on the Socratic view, you're not culpable for the ignorance that you have. It's like, oh, how can I be judged for something that I didn't know? Like that doesn't make any sense. And so,
but if you're willfully ignorant, or if you're ignorant and it's just, if you were a good person, you would have thought of it, then it does seem like you're culpable.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's sort of the difference, at least Yeah, I guess you could probably be an Aristotelian in this regard and still be a universalist, like the sort of Eric Reitan view that, like, well, people will, given an infinite amount of chances, they're going to eventually move towards the good. But on certain views of universalism, it seems like it does presume that sort of Socratic understanding that, like, look, the reason they're not doing the right thing is because they don't know what the right thing is. And so God needs to sort of teach them or train them to do the right thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, don't you think there's some truth to that, though, where it's like, I mean, you can barely understand what God is, and then you say, like, oh, I'm rejecting God. It's like you're fully culpable for that, and you'll be tortured for all time, or you'll be annihilated or turned into a dog or whatever. And it's just like, okay, well, I don't think that people really have a good grasp of what God is, which is like fully his fault, by the way, because he created us with very limited cognitive faculties. Yeah. So it's like, he's culpable for it. Like, I mean, we have limited cognitive faculties. We can't understand what God is. We can't understand the weight of what it is to reject God. And then it's like, oh, you are fully culpable for that, even though you're not responsible for these limitations, which any reasonable person should see. Again, it's like the kid playing around the pit. It's like, well, I want to jump in the pit. It's like, you don't know what you want. Like, you don't know what you're asking for. And if you had more developed cognitive faculties, you would understand that you wouldn't jump in the pit. It's like, the only disanalogy here is like, God created us with those, you know, very limited cognitive faculties. And then some people want to say he like turns around and like blames us and holds us like eternally accountable for these limitations that we are ultimately not responsible for. Even if you believe in libertarian free will, we're not responsible for like our cognitive limitations. Yeah. You know, in the same way that like a kid is not responsible for their limitations.
Yeah, I guess, like, I don't think that in order to choose to accept God's loving union, you have to know the fullness of what God
I'm saying
is.
If you reject it, you don't know what you're rejecting.
Sure.
So, I mean, like, how can you be fully culpable for it?
If you accept it, you don't know what you're accepting either.
Exactly. You don't fully know what you're accepting either. But I'm saying, like, why would it be held against you where you're suffering, like, eternal damnation, whether it's, you know, annihilation or, like, you're being damned to hell? Because it's like, well, I mean, you're rejecting God, but there's no possibility that you fully understand what you're doing when you do that.
Yeah, no, and like that's why the Catholic Church teaches that like mortal sin is something that is done voluntarily under full knowledge, to where like people are acting out, doing what they know.
But it's not about mortal sin. It's about like the sin of infinite gravity of rejecting God. You know, of like, because that's supposed to be this big, scary, like, meta sin that's somehow different from all the other sins. Like, at least that's how William Lane Craig talks about it. Like, oh, well, sins, finite sins warrant finite punishment, whatever. So he grants that, unlike a lot of other psychopaths who think that, like, you know, infinite punishment is warranted for finite sins. He's like, no. Finite sins, finite punishment. Yeah, that makes sense. But rejecting God is a medicine of infinite gravity. It's an actual infinite, everybody. It's an actual infinite of sin gravity, and that's why you go to hell forever. Right. And it's like, okay, but I don't understand how you can do something that you like do not fully understand what you're doing, because in order for you to fully understand a rejection of God, you have to understand God. You have to understand the thing that you're rejecting and what it means to reject. Okay, I'm thinking about a relationship with God, and I'm thinking about God, and I'm rejecting that. Okay, well, in order to be, like, fully culpable for that, it seems like you need to have some kind of informed consent. You have to, like, know what you're doing when you do that. William Lane Craig is like, you don't really know what you're doing, but you're fully culpable. God is so offended, you know, he's, like, so thin-skinned that you rejected him, that he's going to, like, light you on fire for all of eternity. If you're talking about someone with limited faculties, who like doesn't have perfect rationality, doesn't have perfect information, and they're not morally perfect either. You're talking about all these people who have these limitations, and then you're holding them like fully culpable and like allowing them to be tormented for all of time because of their medicine of rejecting God. Like, it's just fucking stupid.
Yeah. It's tricky because a lot of the criticisms of infernalism don't really apply to the view of hell that I've sort of...
I mean, it's made so much more, like, profane because of the punishment that William Lane Craig has in mind.
Right, yeah.
But you're saying you'll just be turned into a dog. And it's like, okay, well, that's not as bad as what William Lane Craig is saying, but, like, still, it doesn't make any sense to really, really punish someone and, like, hold them culpable for rejecting a thing that they can't really fully understand. Like, you're fully accountable for this choice that you made to reject God. and now you're being like diminished in your faculties or something.
Yeah, I guess like, understanding of what the punishment really is. Because like, if the chief punishment of hell is the privation of like beatific vision, I don't know, it seems like there can be cases where somebody does make a decision and they weren't fully informed of what the outcome was. And that was perfectly under their control. Like we can talk about like a game show where like, okay, I have these two briefcases in front of you. You choose briefcase 1 or briefcase 2, and you don't really realize it, but briefcase 2 has $1 million within it.
And this is how you want God to be the game show host, and one briefcase is heaven and one briefcase is hell. I mean, here's the thing. That's actually a good analogy. I think it works against the point you're trying to make. But I'm saying like a universalist could use that analogy of like, you think of God as like a game show host putting up two suitcases. You don't really understand which one is which. And you're like, that one. And he's like, hell for you. And then someone else is like, that one. And you're like, eternal bliss for you. Neither of you have any understanding of what you're doing, but like, well, it's not you don't have any understanding. It's just like, you don't have the level of understanding where it's like, this is fully informed consent. Like whether you accept it or reject it, you just don't really understand it. You know?
It almost raises an ethical quandary then for universalism as well. If like people are choosing to, live in the beatific vision without knowing that, oh, this is going to be a perfect bliss of happiness. Your current mind can't even comprehend the extent of what heaven is going to be for you. Can you really have informed consent in that regard either?
Well, I think if it's a good thing, it's like it's better than you can imagine is not like, well, you can't have it. It's better than you can imagine. That doesn't make any sense. But saying like, no, I can't let you do that. It's worse than you can imagine.
Right.
So there's like an obvious asymmetry there.
Yeah. Well, that's some versions of hell. But if it's a difference between like, oh, I'm choosing this state of retaining or ratifying my imperfect moral character and living out the rest of eternity like that, because I'm content with who I am and I don't want to go through the arduous process of becoming a perfect person. I don't want to do that. Versus, oh, I do want to go through that. It's going to be painful and difficult because like, it goes through admitting my own failures and like accepting that and then moving on and then through time becoming a perfect person in union with God. And it seems like both of those have like some aspect of goodness to that. But of course, on like most forms of hell, it's like, oh, I'm choosing to reject God and because of that, suffer for all of eternity, and I can't comprehend the extent of how bad that's going to be, and so I can't.
But what you're saying is also pretty bad, like where it's like, okay, you're basically going to become like severely disabled cognitively.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's still bad. I mean, it's not. If it's like, well, look, you're just going to be like, or I don't know what you're envisioning exactly, but it's like, it's not hellish, it's not torturous, but it seems like you are saying there's no escape. And you're like being dumbed down. You're like turning into this like subhuman primate, basically. It's like, well, okay, that's not good. And I don't really get the argument for why that's like motivated anyway. But like, it seems like you could just have different levels of heaven or like different kingdoms of heaven without turning people into animals, And it just seems like you could have all the advantages of the view that you're talking about. Without this weird downside where you're like dumbing people down into animals, which is just like a totally pointless bad thing that's happening.
Yeah, that's fair. And like in the episode with Kyle Allender, I sort of elaborated a little bit more, but like my reasons for thinking that, like rather than just keeping their moral character at where they're at and then they get to live in the sort of like minimal happiness of some sort, is that like I think that God would like try to restrain sin. And so if somebody's like moral character is like disposed to do the bad thing when they're given the opportunity to do so, that's going to be kind of bad. And so it would be better
why can't you just put them in circumstances where they can't do the bad thing rather than just take away their like ability? Yeah. Like there are different ways. If you're saying like, well, look, I want to take away their ability to do bad things. One way of doing that is turning them into like a very, very dumbed down animal. Yeah. Another way is just kind of like not letting them in the circumstances. Right. Yeah. So like you could just sort of, if someone is like, I cannot stop being a pedophile and I don't want to stop being a pedophile. And then it's like,
we're locking you up.
It's like, well, then you're just not going to be around kids anymore. Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so you have successfully stopped them from like hurting kids and from doing this evil thing that they refuse to stop doing. Yeah. And it's like, okay, even in this very like fatalist kind of like pessimistic world where you can just never reform anyone to be anything better than what they are right now, which I don't agree with, but like,
right.
especially in like the fullness and eternity of time and like the resources that God has. But it's like, okay, let's just grant that like they're just going to freely choose to do this bad thing and they will just never stop.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, you could dumb them down in the way you're saying, or you could just, there are other things you could change so they can't do this anymore, you know?
Yeah.
And if you're going to talk about forcibly, basically lobotomizing them, maybe you could just forcibly remove their pedophilic desires.
Sure.
That seems less bad to me. It's like just forcibly remove their sinful desire. It's like, and if you even make the case like, well, that's bad. It's like, okay, but it's less bad than lobotomizing them, which is what you're suggesting.
Yeah, no. And like, I guess the reason to think that a full lobotomy is required is because the idea that like a rejection of moral reformation isn't just like, oh, I have this one problem that I need to get rid of. It's like, no, I have no interest in actually like becoming a better person at all. And so that is kind of like the entirety of who you are. And so, yeah, in thinking about which is really a better situation, a pedophile who wants to like rape kids, but is not given any opportunity to do so, versus a non-rational creature that has no pedophilic tendencies, but is able to like live out a happy life. It almost seems like the pedophile, that isn't able to rape kids is like less happy in some respect.
Aren't you I mean, when you're talking about like dumbing people down, it sounds like you're not saying you're really removing their desires or changing any other aspect of their nature. Like if you turn them into chimps, they'd just be violent chimps now.
True.
And it's like, oh, well, that's better because they're not moral agents anymore.
Uh-huh.
And like, so I guess they're doing the same thing, but they're no longer responsible. So like, it's technically better. And I'm like, I mean, sure. But like, if you are talking about removing their desires, then just leave them as humans and remove their desires.
Yeah.
That's the obvious answer. But like, if you're talking about like, well, I'm not going to change their nature other than this one aspect of their nature, which is okay to change for some reason. I'm just going to turn them into animals. It's like, again, like I want to say, if you can change that part of their nature, if that's permissible, then why not change the other part?
Right, yeah.
But I mean, okay, setting that aside, here's the thing, like moral luck kind of enters into this at a certain point. We're not Germans in World War II, you know, so like we never really had the opportunity to be like, I reject Nazism or whatever. And the fact is, a lot of us are lucky that we never had that chance because we would have been Nazis or we would have been good Germans. Like just statistically, that is most people. You either would have been complicit or silent or Nazis. You would have been cruel and you might have even like enjoyed it. You know, you might have been a Nazi and you might have been like, hell yeah, Nazism, you know? So in a sense, we are lucky to not find ourselves in all kinds of circumstances where we are the kind of person where if we were in that situation, we would do that.
Yeah.
And we're not in that situation. And that's the only reason we don't do that. So like, why wouldn't that apply to like this serial unrepentant pedophile where it's like, don't you think it would be better if we just kind of kept them the way they are, but just put them in circumstances where they don't have the opportunity to be evil in that way? Look, just put him in a different circumstance and eventually this just won't be an issue.
Okay.
And then maybe he's and like it just never comes up and enough time goes on that like, you know, there's just other things that happen. And then maybe he'll be reflective for a moment and be like, wow, I guess it's like a good thing that I never find myself in this situation because I would do the bad thing, or like there's a high chance that I would do the bad thing.
Yeah.
And it's like we're all in that situation all the time because we're morally lucky in many, many ways.
Yeah, I guess like my reasons for thinking that is due to sort of like the consent of the damned, to where like if the damned has no desire to go through that sort of moral reformation of character, whether or not it's permissible on God's part to nonetheless put them through those sorts of circumstances that will change them and change their perspective on these sorts of things. And yeah, I guess I can kind of see both ways on that.
Well, do you think they're consenting to have their rational faculties taken away?
I guess probably not, but whether the removal of their rational faculties is, I guess, still in line with some of their intentions. So like, if God provides them with the opportunity to like, look, you can either undergo a significant moral reformation or you can remain who you are. And then your point is that like, well, if they want to remain who they are, and then God's sort of like depriving them of these features that they have, did they consent to that? yeah. And so,
well, because it seems like a hang up for you, like a thing that you want to avoid, the thing that you view as very, very bad is like God coming in and just being like, I'm changing this about your nature, poof. Like I'm just twisting the dials, and you don't consent to it, you don't understand it, but I'm just coming in because I know what's best, and there, I'm pressing the button, now you're different. It seems like you really don't want, that's like morally unacceptable as far as you're concerned, but like it seems like your view involves that.
Yeah. And like any sort of non-universalist case will have to rely upon some sort of like, in my opinion, some sort of view like this sort of like, oh, there's sort of ethical boundaries for God. That's why he doesn't make it so everyone wants to be in perfect union with him. Mm-hmm. And so like, yeah, if somebody doesn't have that desire to be in perfect union with God, and then, yeah, what is God left to do basically with them? And yeah, we can probably like wrap up because it's been a good conversation, and I really appreciate, you being able to sort of like go over this with me. And yeah, there's things that you've said here that I'll definitely want to like re-listen to and like think about further. And especially, what you brought up about how like, well, if God's like inhibiting their faculties, is that something that they consented to? And so like, you'll still have this sort of like ethical quandary there.
Yeah. And you can't have an absolute ban on God stepping in and being like, changing your nature, and I'm just doing it. It's like, well, your view of hell kind of involves that, and like that seems to be one of your reasons for rejecting universalism is like God shouldn't do that or something. And I've tried to say like, well, he wouldn't have to,
right?
But I'm saying like you're sort of setting that boundary there, and it seems like you're crossing it with your view of hell. I can see how like part of my problem is that like I'm responding to certain particular universalists, like maybe like David Bentley Hart, and like I have a significant amount of disagreements with his like whole theology and things like that. But yeah, your point is sort of like, look, you don't need to endorse universal or like David Bentley Hart's like originism with regards to like the whole cosmology and things like that. You can be like, you can hold to libertarian free will, you can hold to all these other things as well, and like still be a universalist. And so yeah, I'll have to think about the most plausible form of universalism, which is like in line with my other like pre-commitments and things like that. So yeah. Well, no, I've really enjoyed it. I'm glad we picked this topic.
Yeah.
But I do have some kind of like, interest in this topic and some kind of like bias towards wanting theism to be true. Like if I can make it work, I would really like to make it work because it's like the best way things could be.
Yeah.
Like foundational reality is all powerful and perfectly loving and everything. It's like, that's just the best way that things could be. And it kind of guarantees that the future is going to be good and that reality on the whole will be good. I mean, I don't agree with David Bentley Hart either on like certain points. Like he's a classical theist and he says, oh, classical theism entails universalism. And it's like, I don't even know what classical theism is when it comes down to it, but you don't have to be a classical theist to be a universalist. Like Andrew Haranich is not a classical theist.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is still one other thing. I know you're sympathetic towards limited forms of theism. Do you think that that's going to sort of come in tension with universalism to some regard?
No, because I still think that God is like very powerful and very knowledgeable and very wise. And like, I mean, I think the most likely constraints are kind of the ones that every Christian and theist like talks about, like you've been talking about, like our moral limitations and stuff like that. And like, what do you do with someone who's just totally unrepentant and that kind of thing? And I'm kind of like, yeah, I think that for a limited God, like as long as he's still very powerful and like very knowledgeable and that sort of thing, you can still end up with like something pretty close to universalism, which is what some forms of limited Christianity buy into, like multiple kingdoms of heaven. Like God can't ensure that everybody ends up in like the highest form of heaven or something. It's like, but his limitations there seem more to do with like our natures, you know, like, well, look, your nature is what it is, and your nature dictates what's good for you to some extent. And you're going to end up in this kingdom of heaven and not that kingdom of heaven, ultimately because of your nature.
Yeah.
And I mean,
and it wouldn't
that
be
still
like,
is, to me, is like a form of universalism.
Right. And it wouldn't be like the morally implausible Calvinism, because it's not like this limited God created them to have that particular nature. It's like something that the universe or unguided nature sort of did that. It's like, you just happen to be this sort of person.
I think even a limited God, if God is what he's said to be, like traditionally, where it's like he's the creator of the universe. I mean, some of the things that are like in scripture are like he knit us in our mother's womb and like knows the number of hairs on our head and that kind of thing. It's like, just given the idea that God is like a creator and that he's like kind of involved in our creation in particular, I find it kind of implausible that like, oh shoot, I can't save everyone after all.
See.
It's like, even a limited God, I think, because he's God, I mean, just because he's limited doesn't mean like he's like the mayor of Boise. He's not like, he's not that limited. He's not like a, he's as powerful as the president of Sudan. It's like, I mean, no, he's still God. He's it's just, he can't like, he doesn't have like a magic wand. Like he can't do anything that's logically possible or some like super high maximal degree of like, omnipotence like that. He still qualifies as a God. So I just don't see it being like a major issue for universalism.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Cause like I bring this up cause Thoughtful Saint on Twitter, he's sort of like made this case that like, well, if you endorse a sort of omnipotent view of God, then like you should be a universalist. But like I endorse a limited view of God. That's why I'm not a universalist. But yeah, the point you make is still good. Like, look, if God is still the one making us and being our ultimate guardian and things like that, he might not be like all powerful, but still he would be powerful enough, like given the fact that we're the objects of his creation, to be able to accept that full perfect end to our life.
And it also just seems implausible that like, again, given other things in scripture, at least like the image of like the shepherd leaving the 99 to go after the one, it just seems implausible that at some point God is just going to give up on some of his children, like where he's just like, like I can totally see, again, if I'm just using the analogy of fatherhood, it's like, well, surely you would give your kids some space under many circumstances. You'd be like, look, they don't want anything to do with me or the good or whatever. And like, I can imagine being like, I just have to take a hands-off approach, or like, I just have to let them go, like be like the prodigal son and just go live in sin for a while, because there's nothing I can say to them to like, and it's like, I can see parents having to do that. But I don't see parents like giving up on their kids, you know. Well,
good parent.
Like, I mean, I think a perfectly loving parent is not going to like give up on their kid, and they might take a hands-off approach, so they might let them really hurt themselves and wander away and that kind of thing. But like, I don't think they're going to let anything really irreversible and excessive happen if it's in their power. Like, this is another example from Andrew where he's like, even if you're talking about like an adult child, parents are going to like stop their child from like attempting suicide or something like that. If it's something really bad, they don't care about your free will. Like, they don't care about the fact that you're an adult who's responsible for their own actions and everything. Like, if it's bad enough, they're going to try to stop you. So I mean, I don't know, when I reflect on like the parenthood stuff and just certain things from scripture, it's like, even if God is limited, I don't see at what point he's going to like give up on certain people. I mean, I don't see why he wouldn't intervene in pretty dramatic ways if something really, really bad was going to happen. So I feel like those are certain reasons to think like the limited God thesis is still compatible with universalism.
Okay. No, thanks.
All right. Nice talking to you, man.
Thanks
for coming on for the 85th time.
Yeah.
Probably the most frequent guest at this point.